right. It's good to see you all. I want to offer my salutation, people from Quebec. Thank you for making the trip here. We appreciate it. I also want to thank all the presenters that have made their presentations throughout these few days. We really appreciate it. This has been a great exercise. And Crystal, are you here? Is she in the room? No, that's fine. I just want to thank her for the work she did this morning on the Christocentric reading of Scripture, and particularly for her critique of the cruciform hermeneutic. It's needed, and we need more of it. Even as a faculty member at the CMU and MBBS, I do a fair amount of public speaking, and from time to time, I manage to offend somebody. I don't mean to do it, but I do it. I don't know if it's because I was born in Quebec City or whatever, but that's the point. This is not right, I thought. So to make sure that nobody, feels targeted, I reread my notes this morning and I realized that I was going to offend everybody at some point or another. So if you feel offended, don't take it personally. Just look beside you and somebody else will feel offended as well. Okay, so in the first part of this lecture, I will seek to define what we mean by biblical theology and systematic theology, at least what I mean by it. And I will show how each one can contribute to the overall hermeneutical process and how they differ from one another. In the second section, I will focus on one specific topic in order to illustrate the specificity of each approach and their possibilities. But before I get into the meat of our topic, let me try to explain the rationale behind the decision to focus at least one lecture on biblical and systematic theology. At least that's my understanding of it. Now, as some of you may know, Anabaptists have always been and still are primarily people of the book, and we saw that well illustrated during these few days. For several reasons, in great part historical, Anabaptists have focused more narrowly on exegesis, on the study of the text. In more recent years, Anabaptists have also enthusiastically embraced biblical theology. In fact, my good friend, Elmer Martins, who's sorely missed, I miss him every day, made a very significant contribution to biblical theology with his seminal work, God's Design. As for systematic theology, my impression is that Anabaptists have not fared as well as they might have. They have either been suspicious of systematic theology or have shown a lack of interest in the discipline. A significant number of Mennonite scholars have and continue to give attention to what is often called political theology, which in a sense might be considered a form of systematic theology, but in my opinion, the jury is still out as to whether the work done in this field will eventually position itself as theology or political ideology. And whether it will lean in one direction or the other will depend on what the center of gravity will turn out to be. That is exegesis, biblical theology, the text, or ideology. Now, this suspicion or lack of interest can be linked to two factors. As far as I can tell, there is a common perception that systematic theology is equal or coterminal with Reformed theology, or what is sometimes labeled as neo-Reformed theology. And perhaps more importantly, there is the perception that systematic theology or doctrinal theology, whether it is in its Reformed, Wesleyan, or dogmatic incarnation, is more akin to the philosophical impulse than the biblical one. Now, personally, I think a thoroughgoing suspicion of systematic theology is rather unfortunate, and I will say more about that a little bit later. Now, part of my agenda is to propose how systematic theology can occupy, in principle, a legitimate place in the overall hermeneutical process. Now, while I focus today on two steps of the interpretive process, that is biblical and systematic theology, it is important to remember, as Grant Osborne points out in his great book, The Hermeneutical Spiral, that the final goal, the end game of hermeneutics, is not biblical theology or systematic theology, but the sermon. In other words, while we must devote our best energy to understanding what the text says, discerning its major themes, organizing the materials in ways that are congenial with our own conceptual and philosophical categories, ultimately, we aim for meaningful, effective, and life-transforming communication. That is so because the Bible is ultimately God's word to humanity, and effective communication is at the core of this word from God. And so the hermeneutical process must ultimately lead to a prophetic discourse. I wish I could say more about that. We'll just leave it at that. Let me first make a couple of clarifying remarks to ensure that we're all on the same page, at least for this particular lecture. I use the word hermeneutics to denote the entire process of interpretation from exegesis to contextualization, or what some call application. Following Osborne, I adopt a meaning significance model in which exegesis and biblical theology focus on the meaning of the text in its original context, and systematic theology and contextualization focusing on the text, on what the text signifies for today. So the purpose of this section is to briefly define and locate where biblical theology and systematic theology fit in the broader process of interpretation. Now, exegesis. To do exegesis is to discern as best as we can the author's intended meaning. And let me be a little bit clearer about that. It is primarily an empirical process whose aim is to determine what a text meant at the time and in the culture it emerged. There's no perfect way to do that. We always do our best. Now, if you agree with me, that would put you firmly in the camp of the originalists. And if you want a clue as to why I'm saying that, the clue is Anthony Scalia. And I will say no more about this. This is, in my opinion, the most important step in the entire process of interpretation. If we fail at that stage, at that level, what we've got is a poisoned well that corrupts the rest of the hermeneutical process. Then we have biblical theology, which is part of the meaning part. I'll talk about that later. We have systematic theology, which is in the significance column. And then we have contextualization, which refers to what the text means for today, for the individual Christian, for the Christian community, and I would dare say also for our society. According to Osborne, biblical theology is that, quote, branch of theological inquiry concerned with tracing themes through the diverse sections of the Bible, and then with seeking the unifying themes that draw the Bible together. It's a very good definition as far as it goes, but I need to parse that a little bit more to make this whole thing feasible and practical. Now, biblical theology can be done in two different ways. There is the first, and there is the second. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Just kidding. Just kidding. Yeah, there's two ways. There's the synthetic, and there is the analytical. These are more personal ways of describing them. So, under the synthetic approach, this is really what churches and denominations seek to do when articulating or reviewing their confession of faith. It is also the approach that we find in major Old Testament and New Testament theologies. I think that's what we were trying to do yesterday afternoon. And it turned out to be a little bit more complicated than what we did yesterday morning. Now, I do not broadly promote this approach in my classes or in my conversations with pastors and others because it is terribly complex and it is an enormous task. It can only be done if you don't have a life. If you have a life, you can't do that. Forget about it. If you have a dog, for example, you got no time to do that. Okay, and then we have the analytical approach. The analytical approach, and that's the one I promote, will tend to focus on the study of an individual text or pericope, a paragraph, a unit of thought, maybe a book, maybe a corpus at the limit. This second approach is by far the most useful way to get at the theology of a text in the context of sermon preparation or contextualization. So once we have determined to the best of our ability, you notice I say that often, what the text says, we can then proceed to identifying the major theological elements that are carried by the text. And I have found over the years, I'm talking like an old man now, because I am. I just turned 60, makes me an old man. It's better than the alternative. Anyways, I have found over the years that the most effective way to get at the theology of a text is to ask three questions pertaining to the articulation of a biblical worldview. That is, what does the text teach about God? What does it teach about humanity? And what does it teach about creation or the universe, the physical universe? And of course, answering those three questions will involve exploring the relationship between all three. The advantage and the real benefit of focusing on worldview is threefold. First of all, that creates a very healthy back and forth movement between exegesis and biblical theology that results in further clarification of the text and its original context. Number two, it creates a new level of abstraction that still has the text at the center of gravity. And number three, this new level of abstraction that is created by biblical theology creates a bridge towards a systematic theology that will be articulated on the basis of biblical theology. Now, as I suggested at the beginning of this lecture, I think the suspicion that some Anabaptists have shown towards systematic theology is somewhat unfortunate and to some extent unwarranted. Systematic theology is very useful in providing a window on the evolution of Christian doctrine, or what some call historical theology. It also represents a good point of reference that may in fact help us set some boundaries as we articulate biblical teachings and explore how they can be relevant for our culture. And I think this is what my good colleague Gordon Matthews tried to say yesterday in the question period. Number two, to welcome systematic theology into the hermeneutical conversation is a way to bring in a broader, theologically sophisticated, and credible community into the hermeneutical process. So those who speak fervently, and I agree with that, in favor of community hermeneutics should be the first to encourage a greater familiarity with dogmatics as a way to include another community into the conversation and as a way to ensure that we don't become theologically insular and or incestuous. Now that should offend a few people right there. All right. Number 3, it's important to remind ourselves also that the kind of dogmatic theology that primarily takes its cue from philosophy represents but one way to construct a systematic theology. It is possible to construct a type of systematic theology that more intentionally emerges from biblical theology. Such a systematic theology can and will use philosophical categories and terminology to articulate and organize theological concepts. But it is a systematic theology that more closely derives from exegesis and biblical theology and is therefore, even at that level of abstraction, still governed by the text. We always go back to the text, like Doug emphasized and re-emphasized this morning. The task of this kind of systematic theology is to serve as an intermediate step, a bridge, if you will, between what was meant, what the text says, and what it means to us, contextualization, and eventually the sermon. So to summarize, biblical theology represents a first level of abstraction that seeks to describe the theological concepts that are found in a text. Biblical theology's center of gravity is the text and is primarily contingent on a rigorous exegesis of the text at hand. Systematic theology represents another level of abstraction, which represents the last stage before the actual contextualization of a text or a doctrine in the church or in the public space. Now I'd like to move to a specific case study to illustrate the difference between the two methods and how the two methods can contribute to the contextualization of the text and eventually the sermon or its being lived out in our culture. So the text I will use, the topic is the sanctity of life. The text I will use is found in Genesis 1:26 to 28. I'll read it rapidly. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, cattle, animals, creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion," and so forth. Now, as the prominent philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer eloquently states in his seminal book on philosophical hermeneutics, Wahrheit und Methode. There are German people here. I'm trying to say it right. We always come, Wahrheit und Methode, truth and method, okay? We always come to a text because of an a priori interest. Even if we are not fully conscious of it, there's always a rationale, a reason, an interest, a question that propels us to read a text. On a very practical level, there are two ways to go about doing biblical theology. One may harvest the elements of biblical theology attested in a given textual unit, or one may begin with a question, like we kind of did yesterday afternoon, and investigate a series of texts in order to derive some theological principles that may be relevant to the issue at hand. For the purposes of this exercise, I have selected Genesis 1:26 to 28, which is the well-known text that defines humanity's status and role in creation. Now, I didn't choose this text at random. There is a preliminary question behind my choice, and the question is simple. it relates to one of the most seminal questions of our time, and that question is, what is a human being worth? Now, the question is very simple at this stage in terms of biblical theology. When we get to systematic theology, the question will become much more elaborate, detailed, and perhaps a little more precise. One methodological note, the selection of relevant texts, and that's very, very important when we look at doing hermeneutics. You got to know which text to select and do your best to do that well. But the selection of relevant texts and the method by which one might choose these texts is very important. Since our time is limited, all I'll say about this is that Genesis 1:26-28 would be foundational because it is part of the creation narrative. And a creation narrative is foundational to answer large questions pertaining to human life. There would also be secondary texts that if we had time we could examine. Those would be like Genesis 9:6 or Psalm 8, Psalm 139 or Jeremiah 1:5. And if we had the time, I would also examine the implications of the incarnation of Jesus Christ for our understanding of human nature. I'm increasingly convinced that the incarnation of Christ represents the loudest, most explicit, and formidable affirmation of the intrinsic value and dignity of human life. And that is because Jesus Christ did not come as a fish, a horse, a mouse, or even a dog. He came as a man, as a human being. All right, so before we get to biblical theology, we got to look at the text and make some exegetical observations. I'm keeping them really, really short and doing it only for the sake of illustration. So here are the kinds of very basic observations you can make out of that text, exegetical observations. Humanity is made in the image of God. It's very, very simple, very plain. On a most basic level, the image of God refers to messenger language, something that Old Testament profs here would know well. Humanity represents God in the world, and humanity is given a position of authority over the rest of creation. Like I said, I could do more, but I'm just going to limit this to this exegetical part to this so that we can move to what biblical theology observations might look like. The difficulty when doing biblical theology is that while it can be conceptualized as a separate step from exegesis, practically speaking, the boundary between the two is very, very fuzzy. Both steps are very much interlocked and flow into each other. So exegetical observations naturally and almost immediately will give rise to biblical theology observations that need to be relegated to your file on biblical theology, because if you don't do it right away, you're going to forget them. They'll be gone. So you got to do it right away. So here are some basic biblical theology observations. Humanity is made in the image of God, so very similar to an exegetical observation. There is a collective dimension inherent to the concept of the image of God. There is also an individual dimension to the notion of the image of God, indicated by male and female. He created them. The image applies to all human beings, not just the Hebrews. Oh, I wish I could say more about that. It's so wonderful. The image applies equally to men and women, males and females. Again, an incredible concept. The collective dimension clarifies humanity's distinct status and represents a universal statement of inclusivity. All members of the human race, regardless of what you look like, your intellectual level, your background, whatever, makes no difference. As long as you can say, I'm a human being, I was born of a woman, you benefit from this exceptional status that is attributed to the human race. It assigns a special status to human beings that is exclusive to humans. We have a special affinity with God. It also assigns, it differentiates humanity from nature. And it's also something that signals an irreducible distance between humans and nature. And that's not a very popular concept these days, I'll tell you that. If biblical theology is descriptive and leans towards exegesis, biblical theology also serves as a bridge towards systematic theology and the sermon by providing a first attempt at organizing the biblical material. Systematic theology is the place where we begin to ask the so what question. This is where we further define and organize the biblical material with a view to addressing contemporary issues. That's why it gets a little bit more complicated, like we saw yesterday afternoon. It will therefore be organized and will be expressed in a way that will be more compatible with contemporary terminology and philosophical categories. So first, let's look at the contemporary questions that may compel us to question the biblical text on the issue of the sanctity of life today. This is the step that will enable us to take the text further down the application highway, more so than we might otherwise. So, the contemporary question, of course, as I've signaled earlier, is what is a human being worth? Now, the answer determines how any given people, any given culture, any given population will treat its weakest and most vulnerable members. And it is a question that is emerging again as one of the major issues of our time. So, what is a human being worth? If history teaches us anything, it is that individual men and women represent one of the least valuable commodities on earth. The devaluation of human life began with Cain and Abel, and it has mostly been a downhill process since then. In the 20th century alone, as Nietzsche warned us, 6 million Jews and countless other millions died during the Nazi era. Between 20 to 50 million people died under Stalin's rule. Under Mao Zedong, 45 million died. Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, had over 1 million of his own citizens mercilessly exterminated through forced labor, starvation, torture, and execution, and that's just the 20th century. Now, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot all had a compelling vision for which they were willing to exterminate millions and millions of innocent men, women, and children to see it come about. Behold the power of utopia. And if there is anything that the church should critique in contemporary culture, is the rise again of new utopias. So, what is a human being worth? Judging from history, not a hill of beans. I thought it was not a whole lot of beans, but apparently it's a hill of beans. English is a bizarre language. A hill of beans. So, what is a human being worth? Next to nothing. And this most deplorable fact was resisted and sometimes reversed in a significant way only where the Judeo-Christian faith took root. And even in the West, where Christianity has been foundational, the sanctity of human life took a huge hit in the 20th century. Now, there are people who in the Western world who think that the intrinsic dignity and value of human life is a given in the Western world. I would not deny that we have a certain awareness of human rights, but I would submit that even with all the attention to the concept of human rights, that the concept of human rights is getting the belief in the intrinsic value and dignity of all human beings can no longer be taken for granted. Let me offer at least 3 reasons for this pessimistic assessment. Now, you realize how long the question is taking to get to systematic theology? You got to do that work first in order to intelligently interrogate the text in order to answer those questions. So, 3 reasons why that's happening. We no longer have a universal foundation to support the concept of human rights and the intrinsic value of human beings. Case in point, I'm going to offend a few more people here. According to one of my CMU colleagues who knows more than I do on these things, nowhere do we find in the Winnipeg Human Rights Museum a statement indicating the foundation for the affirmation of human rights. Not very good. Number 2, with the rise of identity politics, we've been moving into a place where a person's worth and status is determined on the basis of the group they identify with and the specific grievances that this group claims. To make a long story short, once again, and right in step with the historical default position as it pertains to the value of human life, it looks like we are in the early stages of embracing a new and perhaps even more viral form of tribalism. I wonder how Martin Luther King Jr. would react if we brought him back to life today. He's the man who said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." How far we have now strayed from this most noble of ideas is difficult to fathom. The real litmus test to determine where our society stands on this most important of all issues orbits around how we treat the weakest and most vulnerable among us. This litmus test is brutal. It slices right through our self-delusions and shatters whatever virtue signaling we may engage in. And I'm talking about the status of the unborn. I will spare you the statistics. They are absolutely horrendous. In fact, if you have the misfortune of being in the womb today, the best we can say about your situation is that it is precarious. In 2018, the USA reported about 3,800,000 births. During that same year, about 1 million abortions were performed. Do the math. And if you are in Russia, your situation is even worse. I'm going to tell you something. The worshipers of Moloch, you know those guys? Baby killers there in the Old Testament, the Canaanites? They were choir boys compared to us. That's all I'm going to say about that. The most troubling thing about this question, as we can plainly see in the Democratic Party race for the presidential nomination in the United States, is that the issue is now firmly shifting from abortion to infanticide. Democrat lawmakers and presidential nominees are showing a kind of unbridled enthusiasm for terminating innocent human lives inside and outside the womb that can only be qualified as demonic. The corollary issue at the center of this, the greatest issue that every generation must face, is this question, because it's really the bottom question, is who is a human being? Who qualifies as a human being? And note that the answer has nothing to do with an empirical assessment of who a human being is. You put a man and a gorilla beside each other, you ask a bunch of 3rd graders which one is the man, they'll be able to distinguish it. Now, some wives may not be sure. We'll leave it to the 3rd graders. You see, the answer is ultimately grounded in a prior assumption. All of these phenomena, point to the question of human dignity as one of the most seminal and critical questions of our time. Now, while exegeting and analyzing Genesis 1:26 to 28 to ascertain what the text says and identify what its major theological elements may entail is an important task. What makes it necessary to move over to systematic theology is the massive scale of the problem that is emerging in our society, and finding a way to address that issue in categories and terminologies that people will understand. So let me quickly go through what I see as possible elements of systematic theology on the sanctity of life. I offer those as draft statements. I'm not a philosopher and do not pretend to be. But here's the first one. As a divine pronouncement, the concept of the image of God offers a transcendent and authoritative rationale to affirm the intrinsic value and dignity of human life from conception to old age. It offers a theoretical foundation for the recognition that all humans have intrinsic value and dignity. The universal character of the image of God speaks to the intrinsic value of all human beings, regardless of sex, race, skin color, political allegiance. A lot of people died in the Soviet Union for not having the right political ideology and economic status. The individual dimension of the image offers a principled statement of the value of the individual. It offers a counterweight to collectivizing ideologies, such as those inspired by Marxism in the 20th century. It offers a stinging critique of the notion of identity politics. It offers a critique of the tendency to make the individual subservient to collective needs or the needs of the more powerful party in a relationship, whether it's institutional or personal. In other words, to make that very, very practical and to offend even more people, the needs of the unborn baby must be weighed against the needs of the mother. It offers the concept of the image of God undermines a materialistic view of human nature. This text proclaims that we are more than the sum total of molecules and biological processes. There is something immaterial and transcendent about human beings that cannot be quantified by science. This is the idea that Jesus himself proclaimed when he said, "Man shall not live by bread alone." He's more than his appetites. Human beings are more than their appetites, but they shall live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. This wonderful text offers a stinging critique of any ideology that collapses the distinction between humans and nature, because it doesn't recognize the distinct, unique, and exceptional status of human beings. Radical environmentalism, there is another one, rejects the notion of an irreducible distance between nature and humans. And when that happens, the value of particular human beings is contingent on subjective criteria articulated by a particular class of individuals. C.S. Lewis, in his great book, The Abolition of Man, made that point many years ago. In radical environmentalism, the value of individuals will be proportional to the degree to which they embrace the ideology and live in a way that is consistent with it. And that is if we are lucky. There's much more I could say, but I must conclude because that clock is going down. In this presentation, I've tried to define what I mean, anyways, by biblical theology and systematic theology. I've also tried to show how these two disciplines relate to the overall hermeneutical process and to each other. There is, in fact, no contradiction between the one and the other. Biblical theology is more precisely oriented towards the text, whereas systematic theology is more definitely oriented towards the significance of the text for our generation and its communication. Now, while that wasn't explicitly part of my assignment, I hope to have also provided a small glimpse into how the church can speak to our culture in a way that points to real life and the source of all life, which is Jesus Christ himself. Thank you very much.
ladies and gentlemen. There are a lot of questions in our minds. The collective question is there's got to be a lot of them. Step up to the mic. While people are doing that, the question that maybe we can just kind of start out with is, does systematic theology therefore keep shifting and changing with the times? Because I think that's what I heard you say kind of at the end. It's more directed towards kind of the current challenges vis-a-vis biblical theology, maybe less so. You want to?
Well, I mean, there are some classics in systematic theology, like Strong's and Berkhoff and others, Thiessen also. But when, in this particular context, when I'm talking about systematic theology, I'm talking about this extra step that we need to do in order to address what might be considered seminal issues for our times. And it's almost necessary to do that, because as you saw last night, we were given 3 contemporary issues that were very complex. Mm-hmm. And it seems like at some point, exegesis and biblical theology can only go so far. You have to look at those issues, understand the philosophical presuppositions that are behind them, and find a way to articulate a discourse that will address those things in a way that our culture can understand it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, go ahead, Michelle.
Michelle Knowles, right here at WB Church. Thanks, Pierre. I really appreciated that. And as I was listening to you unpack the systematic theology, I was reflecting on our table's discussion yesterday afternoon in the topical breakout session. And I think there were a lot of times where we shifted from what we were supposed to do, which was interpretation, into actually, I think, systematic theology without realizing or naming it as such, but just how our conversation came into context and issues of today. And so I'm thinking about the value in intentionally doing both biblical and systematic theology in the process you've outlined, versus the danger of stepping into systematic theology and philosophical views without actually naming what you're doing and compromising scripture and interpretation through that.
Yeah, there has to be, the ultimate center of gravity always has to be Scripture. And I think Doug said that really well this morning, is no matter what stage of the hermeneutical process we're in, even in the living out, we always have to go back to the text and listen. The text is our foundation. It's the sun. It's the, it's the earth. Everything revolves around it. Good point.
That's good. Just a question. So in my mind, systematic theology seems to be, we have this system, and often the danger was forcing everything into it, versus biblical theology, kind of looking at the whole. But I know you applied it to a topic. So Pentecostal circles, initial evidence, all of a sudden I believe it, so I squeeze everything into it. Or eternal security, somebody believes it, they squeeze everything into it. Could you speak into maybe the good, or of the tension we can live into, rather than squeezing something into a system?
Yeah, I agree. We're always, the human mind systematizes, always. First job that God gives Adam is to systematize, to name things. He creates a taxonomy. It's the first step in the scientific process. We tend to do that. There's strengths and weaknesses with doing it. And I think the way to ensure that we don't fall into excesses is to, together as a community, right? People who critique each other, go back to the text and see and test constantly and consistently whether the text confirms the systems that we develop. I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but that's the only answer I have to that.
All right. Well, final question.
Gordon Matthews, River East, Winnipeg. Pierre, thank you. I really like your worldview analysis, the way you ask the questions. Who is God? What is humanity? What is creation? And what's the relationship among them? The movement to systematic theology, out of one text, which you illustrated well, is limited, however, by the possibility that other texts might speak into the question differently, or might add to. Now, this doesn't pertain specifically to the identity of the unborn, but to the nature of the human being as you put it, irreducibly distanced from nature. I agree that one can see that in Genesis 1. And then Genesis 2 presents us with a human being that is irreducibly connected to nature. Not only to nature, but to the animals, because both human and animals are created out of the fertile ground. So, could you comment about when systematic theology must take into account the diversity of witnesses to the questions you asked, like what is human? It's not that humans are not connected to nature, but it's also not that they are. There's more of a complexity when we expand.
All right, you get 20 seconds.
Yeah. Premises, it all has to do with having clear premises. In these kinds of things, I always go back to the most fundamental texts in terms for, in this instance, what does it mean to be human? And this text makes an affirmation that cannot be proven empirically, that there is something special about human beings, that we have an affinity with God, and that there is a distance, not in so much in terms of our physicality, but that there is a distance in terms of our ontology between us and nature. And that has to be interpreted in the light of, like, for example, creation care, which is a big issue for today. I don't think the church is doing a great job at that these days.
All right, folks, give them a big round of applause. Thank you so much.